Are you excited to jump into Mr. Pandaria but still don't know what class to play? Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into every major spec in PvP, telling you what's new, what to expect, and maybe even what to avoid. Now, one thing we can guarantee is that MoP will feel like a completely new experience, and you really can't even compare it to Cataclysm, even though these expansions really launched back to back. MoP completely overhauled the talent system, while pumping every single spec with some ridiculous mechanics, and even introduced an entirely new class. So, yeah, there's a lot to expect here. That's why we're here to help, man, with another 400 rating gain guarantee while using our brand new guides at skillcap.com. For the past few months, we've really been hard at work, collaborating with the best players in the world with brand new courses for classic PvP. We have jam-packed over a decade of knowledge into bite-sized videos which teach every spec from the ground up, getting you ahead of the competition instantly. Now, funny enough, this is actually going to be the second time we've made guides for Mr. Pandaria, so if you want to reach your potential and reach it fast, be sure to use the exclusive discount link below to access our rating gain guarantee. For now, let's get back to the video though, by looking at our first class, the Death Knight. Now, between both specs, Unholy is clearly going to be the better option for PvP. The spec does retain its identity as a brawler in PvP. It's one of those specs that wants to rush down the opponent, doing unrelenting damage. Live fast, die young is the mantra. The spec does retain its identity as the master of the undead, not only having high sustained damage, but also having one of the deadliest cooldown windows thanks to the combination of Unholy Frenzy and Summon Gargoyle. Now, adding on to the pressure is the iconic Necrotic Strike, which continues to act as a healing absorption, making Unholy DKs an excellent pair for any Mortal Strike spec. Mr. Pandaria introduces some new abilities to elevate their brawling capabilities, including Soul Reaper, which is an insanely scary execute effect that automatically triggers when the target dips low on HP. And thanks to the talent tree rework, every DK spec picks up Asphyxiate, transforming their Strangulate into a stun. Now, while this might seem minor, it actually means way more flexibility with comps. DKs now have a reliable lockdown option with other classes that lack a stun. DKs even get a new defensive option in the form of Conversion, which converts runic power into health and can be selected as an alternative talent to Death Pact. Now, while this doesn't solve every one of their defensive issues, it is great for giving more control over self-healing. But above all, one of the most game-breaking abilities MoP offers is Desecrated Ground, which is ridiculous, an ability that not only breaks crowd control, but also provides immunity to subsequent CC effects while the DK stands in its radius. Now, this means that DKs have not one, not two, but 3 different stun breakers in MoP, enabling a highly aggressive playstyle where damage is almost unstoppable. While Unholy Death Knight might not be the star of the show in Mr. Pandaria, it is still an absolute powerhouse. When paired with other heavy hitters like Hunters and Warriors, this spec becomes the perfect supporting character, ready to overwhelm opponents with ridiculous pressure. So, moving on, we have Druid, which is a class lucky enough to have multiple viable specs. But before we get into it, the class as a whole picks up some wild new tech, including Symbiosis, which allows them to borrow spells with a friendly target in a mutual exchange. This allows Resto Druids to pick up abilities like Ice Block, Balance Druids, Unending Resolve, and we're not joking, Ferals can even get Bubble. On screen, we have a list of every spell Druid can gain, as well as all of the abilities that they can give their partners. Now, keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean each person is stealing a spell, but instead gaining an entirely new ability. And as you might have guessed, this is an absolutely wildly broken mechanic. But it doesn't stop there, as Mr. Pandaria is also the first expansion to introduce Heart of the Wild, which is significantly stronger for Balance, Feral, and Resto, giving every spec a massive healing boost for 45 seconds. And if you happen to play Resto, you're also going to get a huge damage increase during this time and can put out comparable DPS to an actual damage dealer. On the same talent tier to Heart of the Wild is Nature's Vigil, which can be preferred in some matchups and transfers significantly more damage into healing and vice versa. MoP also helps solve some mobility issues for Resto and Boomkin with Displacer Beast as a new talent, giving them an instant blink effect to quickly escape damage. And on the CC side, every Druid spec gets access to Typhoon and a brand new talent called Disorienting Roar. Now, you might be familiar with this spell from retail, but in MoP, it is arguably stronger, as it doesn't DR with Polymorph, Freezing Trap Sap, or Gouge. Finally, Nature's Swiftness now has its cooldown reduced all the way to 1 minute and can even be used on Cyclone. But enough about what's new here. How does each spec actually play? Balanced Druids are playing a more dynamic role in Arena. In Cataclysm, this spec was more or less kind of a dotting machine, designed to pad the meters with Moonfire and Insect Swarm. In MoP, things are, well, slightly different. Not only is casted damage more relevant, but Boomkins also pick up Force of Nature, allowing them to instantly root targets, enabling the classic Root Beam combo that we all know and love today. Boomkins also become more punchy thanks to their new cooldown of Celestial Alignment. Along with their new capabilities to crowd control, this means Boomies can do actual goes for the very first time, all while having a considerable amount of off healing to protect their team. Now, when it comes to Feral, what's more important to understand is the fact that this was one of the god specs during Cataclysm. And although it doesn't quite retain that status in MoP, it is still pretty dang strong. The spec preserves its identity as a quintessential dot burst hybrid. Their damage profile is quite balanced between bleeds and punchy damage coming out of the ferocious bite. Now, one of the biggest decisions you have as a Feral Druid is whether you want to play an even more burst-centric build with Incarnation, or whether you want additional control with Force of Nature. But if there's one spec that does see a massive power spike in MoP, it's definitely Resto. Not only does this spec gain more healing and more mobility, but it has unmatched control. Part of this is due to NS becoming a 1 minute cooldown. But another key reason is the introduction of Soul of the Forest, which enables the Druid to get quick cast Cyclones after every Swiftman. Resto Druids have way more opportunities to CC in MoP compared to any other expansion. In fact, one of the main comp archetypes in Mists of Pandaria is Mage Druid. Between having spammable CC, multiple stuns, a disorient, knocks, and even 2 blanket silences, this composition can completely lock down the enemy team. And you heard that right, Druids even have a blanket silence in MoP thanks to a glyph. Now, without a doubt, Resto Druid is one of the strongest specs throughout the entirety of MoP, and thanks to its balanced combination of healing and control, it can fit into almost any composition and does well in every single bracket. In any case, you really can't go wrong playing Druid in MoP. Every spec is highly competitive and offers a little bit of something for everyone. But now it's time to move on to Hunters, which is our first pure DPS class lucky enough to have 3 viable specs. Now, the class as a whole sees a few massive improvements in MoP. Thanks to a reworked talent tree, every spec is able to pick up Wyvern Sting or Binding Shot, which makes Hunters one of the best classes in terms of raw control. MoP also gives every Hunter access to a knockback effect thanks to Glyph of Explosive Trap, which can be used to knock players off the Z-axis on maps like Blade's Edge or Arena, or to simply proc the stun effect from Binding Shot. Hunters even pick up some new defensive tech in the form of self-healing. Newly introduced talents like Exhilaration and Spirit Bond allow the class to be more self-sustainable compared to the past. Now, perhaps the most wild addition to the class in this expansion is absolutely Stampede, an ability which summons an entire stable of pets to fight in battle. Now, if you were lucky enough to play in the early days of MoP, this ability was absolutely, totally, ridiculously broken, but eventually its damage was reduced thanks to a bug fix. In any case, along with new damaging abilities like Glaive Toss and a Murder of Crows, Hunters can pack a punch. Now, although all 3 specs are competitive, Beast Mastery is arguably going to be the worst, but don't let that fool you. BM is a niche pick, but the key perk is that you can break its pet out of CC with Bestial Wrath in order to pump out damage. And just like the previous expansions, BM is able to tame exotic pets like Spirit Beast and Devil Sores, which can have unique interactions with Stampede. Now, for the most part, Survival and Marksmanship are pretty much the same spec, but with slightly different damage profiles. As is tradition, Marks has big punchy burst damage, while Survival has a flatter, more consistent damage profile. Now, what this means is that Marks tends to excel in more setup-heavy comps, whereas Survival can play with more diverse specs, including Affliction Warlocks of all things. Now, one key difference between both specs are the unique utility spells they offer. Marks gets Silencing Shot, which is a strict upgrade to Counter Shot thanks to an additional 3-second blanket silence effect, while Survival gets Entrapment, giving it a root effect instantly tied into Ice and Snake Trap. Now, overall, you really can't go wrong playing a Hunter in Mists of Pandaria. While they aren't the star of the show, the class is consistently good for the entirety of the expansion, having the perfect toolkit to synergize with the control-heavy meta of the newest classic expansion. And speaking of control, mages are on an entirely different level. This is definitely one of the god classes in MoP. Mages were blessed with one of the best talent trees in the expansion, with abilities like Presence of Mind and Cold Snap being accessible to all 3 specs. That's right, not only do mages have the ability to instantly polymorph every 90 seconds, but now both Arcane and Fire even have an additional ice block every game. And to make things even crazier, every mage spec now has Deep Freeze, which becomes a crucial part of the win condition for Arcane and Fire, but more on that just a little bit later. MoP is also the expansion that introduces Alter Time, which in its original form was much stronger than the version that we know of today. This is because it can actually be used to snapshot buffs, including damage procs, trinkets, and even Presence of Mind itself. This transforms it into one of the most dynamic cooldowns ever in PvP. And don't sleep on the defensive kit of mages either, as every single spec can spec into Temporal Shield, which converts damage into healing and is even usable while in CC with a global cooldown of 0. But now, let's dive into each spec one by one. Starting it off with Frost, which we expect to be one of the most popular specializations in the entire game. Why is that? Well, it's arguably the most powerful spec of all time, man. Between Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze procs, Frost can do an absurd amount of instant damage, which can all be snapshotted with Alter Time. Due to its solid damage output and unmatched control, Frost Mage is one of the most diverse specs in the entire game and can play almost any comp, pairing best with Restoration Druids for some absolutely ridiculous CC setups. Now, your job as a Frost Mage is to dictate the game. You are the director in every matchup. When paired with another melee, your job is to harass that healer with CC and burst the kill target during goes. But when paired with another wizard, it's going to be you who's responsible for buttering up the kill target and blasting them down during Deep Freeze. Frost Mage is truly the jack of all trades and a master of all. Fire, definitely going to be more of a specialist and one of those hidden bosses of the expansion. The spec is built around doing as much damage as possible into Deep Freeze, shattering back-to-back Power Blast and one of the most deadly burst combos in the entire game. This is a spec that has a very strict burst setup and does 90% of its damage during these small goes. Now, because of this, Fire is a little bit more restricted in comp selection. It needs to be able to set up Deep Freezes on the kill target, which generally means pairing it with other wizards, especially Shadow Priest and Warlocks who can assist with cross CC. Now, that all leaves Arcane, which is definitely the worst out of the 3 specs and is borderline just a little bit gimmicky. It can do insanely high damage during Arcane power, one-shotting players in Deep Freeze, but outside of that, this spec can really struggle. No matter what, if you play Mage, you're probably going to have a pretty good time. Again, this might be a little bit of the peak class in terms of strength, as you have plenty of new tools to express your skill. So this all brings us to the Monk, which is obviously the class first introduced in MISTS Pandaria. Now, at the time, this was a really big deal since it was the second class ever added to the game following DK's in Wrath of the Lich King. Although monks did have a rocky start to the expansion in its original release, they were slowly developed into absolute powerhouses as the seasons progressed. Monks have all their familiar CC abilities, including Endcap and Leg Sweep, but Ring of Peace is, well, it's wildly different here. Instead of being a grounded AoE spell, it's actually a buff that the monk puts on a friendly target, silencing and disarming enemy players within its radius. Monks also have many of the same defensive abilities, but are even lucky enough to have a spell called Nimble Brew, which acts as a secondary CC breaker that does not share a cooldown with the PvP trinket. Monks even get this very obscure ability called Zen Meditation, which sort of acts like an AoE grounding totem, allowing them to channel out a spell that redirects spells for 8 seconds, breaking instantly on any damage. Now, at its core, Mistweaver monks do have a very similar baseline healing kit to today's game, but with one huge, massive, glaring difference: Chi. That's right, the resource system that's now used by Windwalker monks was originally part of the monk class as a whole. Mistweaver monks in MoP do have some familiar spells though, Renewing Mist, Enveloping, and Soothing Mist, with Vivify originally being a spell called Surging Mist. But what was highly unique at the time was a brand new healing mechanic: Healing Spheres. More commonly referred to as orbs today, this ability allows the monk to place small healing spheres on the ground that heal nearby players. This means monks technically do have a spammable skill shot ability in MoP, with a GCD of 0.5 seconds. When mastered, this ability, well, it's incredibly strong. Mistweaver monks even have one of the most broken defensive passives of all time, Dematerialize. When stunned, this is going to give them 2.5 seconds of complete immunity to all attacks, which makes them very tough to kill, especially alongside the Stunbreaker from Nimble Brew. Now, when it comes to Windwalker Monk, this is easily one of the best melee throughout the entire expansion. This spec plays much like a classic brawler, having a solid mix of high sustain damage and very threatening burst. Now, the way Windwalker Monk bursts in MoP is relatively unique. Throughout the game, they're going to be building stacks of Tiger's Eye Brew, which can then be consumed in order to tap into a massive 60% damage modifier for 15 seconds. But here's where things do get just a little bit interesting, because monks also have access to Storm, Earth, and Fire, which of course summons clones of the monk, splitting their damage. In MoP, this can be used to individually attack different targets, which means Windwalker monks can passively AoE multiple players down, especially during cooldown windows. Monks are also lucky enough to have a second stun in this expansion thanks to Fist of Fury, which will lock down any target within its area of effect, all while doing some pretty serious damage as well. By now, you should definitely see why Windwalker monks are considered one of the best melee in the game. But now, it's time to talk about Paladins, who definitely see improvement in one big area: crowd control. The reworked talent trees allow Paladins to choose between a long-range, short CD stun, repentance, or even an improved version of Turn Evil, which allows it to be cast on enemy players. That's right, MoP gives Paladins tons of options. Oh, and this does just happen to be the expansion where Blinding Light was added to the game. Now, we weren't joking when we said that Pally CC is Omega buffed in this expansion. And on the utility side, Paladins received a massive class-wide buff thanks to the Clemency talent, adding a second charge of Hand of Sacrifice, Freedom, and Protection. That's right, every major utility spell has 2 charges for both Holy and Red. Holy does see some targeted improvements, including the introduction of Eternal Flame, which gives the spec a healing over time effect tied into Word of Glory. If you've ever played Holy Paladin before, you know that HOTS aren't exactly your strong suit, and this is going to help fill that void just a little bit. Holy Pally is a solid healer overall, especially in the early expansion, having a wide range of playable comps. Now, in some ways, it's sort of tailor-fit to work with cleaves. Whether it's TSG, Turbo Cleave, or some double wizard comp, this spec is going to perform extremely well, especially with 2 charges of every hand spell. Now, with that in mind, Ret Paladins might have the most broken utility in the game thanks to Hand of Sacrifice of all things. In MoP, this spell is actually going to break the target out of harmful magic CC, which is absolutely wild to think about. Red Paladins are known for their utility in retail thanks to Blessing of Sanctuary removing stuns, fears, and silences. But this is on a completely different level. Red also continues to have really great off-healing though too, but it isn't as limited on who that healing is meant for. In Kata, Paladins had more healing for their partners, but MoP makes things way more balanced. And on the damage side of things, Red Paladins do offer a lot of burst damage. Wings is definitely one of those cooldowns you need to respect, especially since it can no longer be dispelled. Now, for better or worse, Ret really isn't the star of the show in most comps. It's definitely there to play a supporting role for other OP specs, like Arms Warriors or even Hunters or DKs. As long as you're willing to make the most out of your utility, you're doing something right. But what is new with Priest and Mists of Pandaria? There's a lot to talk about here. First, what might come as a complete shock is that Holy is actually the preferred healing spec in this expansion. In fact, with the exception of TBC, MoP was the only classic expansion where Holy was competitively viable, but more on that just a little bit later. The class as a whole picks up some unique tech during this expansion, including Psyfiend, which worked significantly different then. Instead of applying an MS effect, it tries to cast Fear on nearby players, giving Priests an entirely new way to land CC. Priests also get a massive boost to mobility thanks to the introduction of Angelic Feather, which is a whopping 80% movement speed increase. They even get a stealth mechanic with Spectral Guise, and the combination of these 2 abilities together makes it easier than ever to cross the map. MoP is also the expansion that gives Priests their Void Shift, which is more commonly called Life Swap. For better or worse, this ability is only usable by the healing specs in the patch we're going to be playing on, but it was and forever will be one of the best utility mechanics ever introduced in Arena. But let's dive deeper into each major spec, starting with Holy. One weird difference from retail is that MoP Holy Priest has stances similar to that of a warrior. There's a stance for single target healing, one for damage, and one for AoE healing. It does seem a little bit daunting at first when you learn the spec, but most of the time, it's the single target Serenity Chakra that's going to be used in Arena. These stances even give priests unique Holy Word spells, Serenity for an instant heal, Chastise for a disorient, and Sanctuary for an AoE heal. Now, one of the main reasons why Holy is the superior spec in this expansion is pretty simple. It has a ton of instant cast healing. This spec is centered around classic spells like Palm and Renew, but also has powerful Flash of Light procs and Holy Word Serenities to top an HP bar. And thanks to its Chastise, Holy Priest is really good at setting up its own CC on healers, stunning them in place, and then crossing the map with Feather and Spectral Guise in order to land an AoE fear. Mastering this spec requires you to maintain tempo. Tempo is the word. It's an aggressive healer designed to push in and play a supporting role in setting up kills with their team. And as the expansion defined by coordinated offensive play, it is no wonder Holy takes a huge lead over Discipline here. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with Shadow Priest in the older expansions, the spec seemed to go through kind of radical changes every single expansion, and Mists of Pandaria, well, it's no different. The expansion gives the spec a new secondary resource called Shadow Orbs, which are kind of like a mix of soul shards and combo points. Shadow Priest can build orbs with Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death, and then spend them on Devouring Plague for damage or on Psychic Horror for CC. Now, of course, having access to the iconic Stun Silence combo on top of having a good mix of Rot damage and Burst allows Shadow Priest to fit into a wide variety of comps, though they do typically do best with mages. No surprise there. Now, as a reminder, hybrid healing is actually really good in MoP, and Shadow Priest really do lean into their support role thanks to the power of off heals like Prayer of Mending, Flash Heal, and Power Word Shield. So if you're wanting an all-around experience as a caster, then Shadow Priest might be the right pick for you. Next up, we have Rogue, a class that also gains a ton of crazy tech in this expansion. The talent tree rework would give the entire class the brand new Subterfuge mechanic, which during MoP actually makes the Rogue invisible for 3 seconds on top of acting as a mini shadow dance. Rogues can even give stealth to their entire team thanks to Shroud of Concealment, which enables crazy openers from comps like RMD and Thug Cleave. The class even picks up some additional utility with Nerve Strike, which reduces damage and healing done by targets for 6 seconds after stuns. Enemy players even take an additional 10% damage during the Rogue CC thanks to Prey on the Weak. Now, on the mobility side, Rogues are given one of the most broken abilities of all time, Burst of Speed, which is a spammable sprint that removes snare effects in the process. MoP also gives Rogues their iconic Elusiveness talent, turning Feint into 30% damage reduction, again with no cooldown. And finally, on the offensive end, Rogues get marked for death for instant combo point generation, and then a flex talent called Paralytic Poison, which can be played for an additional stun effect. Now, we weren't joking when we said Rogues get a lot of crazy stuff. Now, unfortunately, Assassination really isn't all that great for PvP. Subtlety is going to be the preferred spec by far, but Combat, which is the original version of Outlaw, does have its niche as well. Sub-Rogue and MoP, it takes a dramatic shift from its design in Cataclysm. And in case you didn't know, Cata Sub-Rogues were beast and played almost a little bit like a brawler melee. MoP Sub-Rogue, it's entirely different, thanks in part to an old mechanic called Master of Subtlety. This, along with Prey on the Weak and Subterfuge, gives Sub-Rogues huge damage out of stealth and during Shadow Dance, but very little damage in between. And as a result, most Sub-Rogues kind of adopt a hit-and-run playstyle, opening on one target, dancing on another, and then running for re-stealths with Burst of Speed to rinse and repeat. Now, while this playstyle can feel a little bit limited at times, Rogues make excellent partners for setup classes like Mages and Hunters, and can even pair with other wizards like Warlocks, Shadow Priest, and even Elemental Shamans. Now, in case you wanted a little bit more of a brawler playstyle, then Combat might be the spec for you. The spec centers around a passive called Bandit's Guile. By pressing Sinister Strike, you build a buff from green to yellow to red, increasing damage by up to 30%, encouraging you to stick on target. Combat Rogues also have an ability called Revealing Strike, which increases the effectiveness of finishers, including Kidney Shot, which can last around 8 seconds with this debuff active. Together with red buff and killing spree, this can snowball into huge pressure. Moving on to Shaman, we have yet another hybrid class with 3 very viable specs. The talent tree rework gives every Shaman spec some consistent defensive options, including Nature's Guardian, and makes Shamanistic Rage available to Elemental. Shamans also pick up some fun new utility with the introduction of Windwalk Totem, which gives their whole team a freedom effect, and Stormlash Totem, which adds bonus damage to everyone's attacks. Each Shaman spec also gets access to Healing Tide in this expansion as well. Mop is also the first time Shamans could throw their totems across the entire map thanks to Totemic Projection, though this does share a talent slot with Call of the Elements, which allows them to reset most of their totems, which is extremely powerful as you can imagine. Now, among all the spells introduced for Shamans in Mop, Ascendance is definitely the most iconic. While it's not as broken for Ellie and Resto, it's easily one of the scariest cooldowns in the game for Enhancement, giving massive burst damage and ranged attacks. But before we talk about Enhance, let's take a look at Elemental. Now, if you played Kata, this might have been a niche and sometimes forgettable spec, but the classic Hybrid Dampener, he is back in Mop. One huge reason for this is the fact that Ellie now has Shamanistic Rage, which helps cover some annoying defensive problems from the previous expansions. And on top of this, Ellie has a much easier time dealing damage as Lava Surge now makes Lava Burst instant, instead of simply resetting its cooldown. Along with Unleash Weapon, this means Shamans can do some absolutely crazy instant cast burst, which can be extremely deadly with Overload procs. Now, because of its great utility and high sustained damage, Elemental fits in with multiple comp archetypes, but will find the most success with Warriors and Warlocks. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the hallmark feature of Enhancement Shaman is Ascendance. This might be the scariest cooldown in the entire expansion, causing a massive, almost unavoidable onslaught of damage. But outside of this, Enhancement continues to offer a really unique benefit: instant hexes, being able to reliably land a long-duration CC every few seconds thanks to Maelstrom Weapon. And remember, this is the expansion where hybrid healing might have been at its peak, and Maelstrom can also be spent for some instant heals. Now, in case you weren't aware, Resto Shamans were the undisputed gods of Cataclysm, and even though they might have lost that title going into Mop, they're still extremely competitive. In fact, even though Mage Druid is part of the so-called god comp of the expansion, Lock Shaman, it's right up there too. Now, unlike Retail, Mop Resto Shaman is very passive. It's one of those healers who likes to hang back, pump out heals, and be as disruptive as possible with kicks, purges, and so on. Healing Stream Totem is a huge part of what makes Resto Shaman work in Mop. You might as well call it Healing Tide Totem, because it's absolutely ridiculous how strong it actually is on its own, not to mention the fact that there's an entire glyph to make it even better against casters. In any case, if you're looking to roll Shaman in Mop, you will not be disappointed. All 3 specs, they are all highly competitive in a wide range of comps, especially when a Warlock is thrown into the mix. And speaking of which, Warlocks are yet another class which was blessed by some ridiculous mechanics in MISTS Pandaria. This is the expansion that gives the class their iconic Gateway, which has a longer cast time in Mop, but has a much longer range and a shorter cooldown. Defensively, Warlocks pick up a new self-heal called Dark Regeneration and get Unending Resolve for the very first time. These are not too crazy on their own, but Warlocks continue to have Soul Link for a passive 20% damage reduction, and even have the ability to play a brand new talent called Dark Bargain, which absorbs 100% of damage for 8 seconds, converting it into a dot for later. Every Warlock spec also gets access to Shadow Fury, which obviously is not that big of a deal for Destro, but is a massive benefit for Affliction, which is arguably the best Warlock spec of the entire expansion. And now on to something a little bit ridiculous. The entire class gets a talent that acts as a PvP trinket on a 1-minute cooldown. We shouldn't have to explain why that's absolutely insane. Warlocks even get empowered pets, where instead of a Fell Hunter, you can summon a giant floating octopus that shoots laser beams. Oh, and you just so happen to get 2 charges of your main offensive cooldown. It is no wonder that Lock Shaman won BlizzCon 3 times in a dang row during Mop. And as we mentioned, Affliction is probably the best Warlock spec in Mop. They are just so good and fill some weird niche. The perk of Affliction during this expansion is the fact that they can soul burn out an entire row of dots. That is right, you barely even need to cast anything outside of Fear, Haunt, and Malefic Grasp. All you do is press Soulburn, get out your dots, and then infinitely swap them all game. Now, you have to keep in mind that this was during an era where dot damage was actually good, and as the #1 dot spec in the entire game, Warlocks can play a ton of different comps. You have your classics like MLS and LSD, but can also play the new flavor of the month, Windwalker Lock Shaman. Now, with that out of the way, as far as demonology is concerned, this spec is definitely the weirdest of the bunch. This was a time where demo Warlocks had an actual demon form, transforming them into Illidan Stormrage wearing a pair of purple pajamas. Oddly enough, this spell was called Metamorphosis and was eventually just yoinked by demon hunters. Anyway, you have all your classic demo Warlock things, including a big pet who can axe toss stun, but you also have some wild new abilities that are only usable in demon form, including Chaos Wave, which does big AoE damage. Destro is a little bit weird in MoP, let's be honest. Don't get us wrong though, the spec is definitely really good. Chaos Bolt hits insanely hard during this expansion, but does have one obvious drawback. It's cast time. That means Destro Warlocks are a bit more limited in comp selection, at least compared to Affliction. They really need another class to enable them, usually something like a Mage or a Druid. Now we should also note that Shadowburn is an actual execute in MoP. You don't want to find yourself below 20% against a Destro Warlock because it's basically touch of death range. And while we're on the topic of executes, let's talk about warriors. And to get the elephant in the room out of the way here, Fury, it's dead. Don't ask questions. We won't worry about it. Arms is by far the best warrior spec and is arguably the best melee in the game. But why is that? One word: control. The reworked talent trees mean Arms Warrior now has 2 charges of, well, charge. They also have 2 stuns with Shockwave and Stormbolt. Oh, and they also have 2 interrupts too. But now one of them is AoE. And how could we forget they have 2 spell reflects too, and one is also AoE. If you want to learn how to make a class OP, just give it 2 of everything. That's what Blizzard did. Also, warriors just have insane utility during MoP, including having Safeguard to act as a stronger version of Intervene. You also have these cool new banners, one that gives your team steroids and the other that takes the steroids away from the enemy team. You can even intervene your own banner to get out roots, which is pretty neat as well, I guess. Warriors also have really good damage in MoP while also being practically immortal thanks to Second Wind. Seriously, this single talent does enough self-healing that warriors can actually play double DPS 2v2 and get away with it. All of these new tools allow the class to slot right into most comps in 3v3. You can play melee cleaves or with wizards. Nothing is going to hold you back. And if you are serious about hitting those rating goals in Classic, Retail, or even League of Legends and Valorant, be sure to check out skillcap.com. We have been hard at work with the very best players, and we have made 0 compromises in producing the best guides for PvP, period. Full stop. With one subscription for as little as $9 a month, you get instant access to thousands of exclusive videos designed with one purpose: to bring you to your potential fast. And we are so confident that we can deliver on this promise that we even offer a rank up guarantee. Yes, you are going to climb rating while using our guides, or you will get a full refund, no questions asked. So what in the world are you waiting for, man? Visit the links below, get started today with an exclusive discount offer. Anyway, guys, we want to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.